everybody. It's great to be here. Share with you some new thoughts we have around where do economic clusters come from? How does that relate to AI? And how does it relate to the geography of AI as it goes forward? Because so many cities around the world, so many regions, so many countries are trying to say, how do we get this kind of capability? Because I think a lot of nations and a lot of cities are starting to say, boy, this is really going to be the next wave of um, I won't say industrialization, but the next wave of corporate innovation and economic development. So in order to get at this, I wanted to let me see here first. Let me share. Let me share my desktop, and I'm going to go into the slideshow here. Can everybody see that? Okay. The Discovery Advantage.
We can, John.
Great. Okay. This all begins back 35 years ago when I was a young professor at Harvard Business School. And I get a wonderful chance to go in and see Al Chandler, who's the person sitting on the left. And Al is a famous business historian, basically documented the invention of modern management, what he calls managerial capitalism, as one of the most important inventions of mankind. And he has series of books, Strategy and Structure, Scale and Scope, The Visible Hand. He won the Bancroft Prize. Just an unbelievable historian documenting the whole process of management as an invention. Over on the right, we have Mike Porter, and Mike, of course, just a world famous, fantastically productive and innovative thinker. And in 1990, he came out with his book, The Competitive Advantage of Nations. And I had the good fortune of being in a faculty meeting. There's about 200 plus faculty, big show, where Al was reviewing Mike's book, The Competitive Advantage of Nations. And I'll never forget the first thing that Al said. He said, first of all, Mike, this is a fantastic contribution. It's a real tour de force. And he said, perhaps its most important contribution to the field of management and to the intellectual, coda is the idea of the economic cluster. Many people before Ricardo, others had thought about the competitive advantage of nations, and people talked about markets and so forth. No one had identified the idea that actually, if you look at economic development, it's incredibly clustered in given geographies, and it's not always a country, it's usually a region, and that region might actually spill over into different countries and so forth. And so Mike get at that, and he started to say, what is it that drives the economic cluster? What are these things? And this is the book on the left-hand side. I do recommend it to you. It's a fantastic book. Over on the right-hand side is the core model that Mike came up with. And oh, by the way, anybody who has questions or want to interrupt or anything, clarification, disagreement, and so forth, feel free to do so. Over on the right-hand side, Mike's first book was called Competitive Strategy, and it talked about firm strategy, structure, and rivalry, the 5 forces model, for those of you who might have read that or seen that. That came from Mike 10 years before this book. And then there's factor conditions. That is, what are the things that go into the creation of an economic cluster? Supporting industries. So when you think about Silicon Valley, for example, you've got fantastic, memory devices that were then feeding into computer creation. And then demand conditions. So, for example, for many years, certainly in the 90s and year 2000, Japan had some of the best consumer electronics because the quality of consumption, the demands that the Japanese consumer made on the creation of fantastic new devices was actually higher than the rest of the world. For those of you who've been to Tokyo and gone to, Arihakaba, where the electronics area, where you get just fantastic innovation and so forth. So the demand conditions are also part of the economic cluster. And Mike really pointed out a number of things. One of the things is that we've got, of course, Silicon Valley as an economic cluster. But it turns out that economic clusters are all over the place. If you're interested in very high-end ski boots, it's a combination of the northern part of Italy and part of France that actually is the world center for the best ski boots in the world. Chemicals, if you look in the Delaware, New Jersey area, largely starting out with DuPont. By the way, Al Chandler's middle name was DuPont. He was a DuPont of the DuPont family. But the Brandywine Works down along the Delaware River, and that whole area, South Jersey and Delaware, is a hotbed of chemical development. Hollywood, of course, all fantastic there. Over on the right hand side, turns out that if you want fancy tiles, world class tiles are usually in northern Italy, and you have Switzerland for chocolate. You have, if you look around the world, you just see cluster after cluster of economic development. So, where are the AI clusters? Well, according to a recent survey, the Western AI clusters, obviously there's some in China, but there's in Singapore, but there's Silicon Valley, New York City, London, Toronto, and Boston are the biggest AI clusters in the Western world. And the Toronto thing actually has a lot to do with a thing called the Fusion Institute, which was set up around Jeff Hinton, one of the fathers of neural AI and of the current AI wave. Also, in kind of a sobering way, things today is going to kill us all. That's for another day. But Jeff Hinton was supported by a grant that was given in Toronto. Okay. Now, the interesting thing about when you look at economic cluster development, I've had the good fortune of being part of teams that tried to help the Middle East figure out how to create an economic cluster. The EU, we're working for the folks in Brussels. When I was at PwC, there's a big effort to say, okay, how do we bring more biotech? So I've seen some of these deep analyses about the creation of economic cluster, and a lot of times it focuses on things that are important, I think, but not essential. So the kind of things that they focus on are things like tax incentives, the ability to get good infrastructure, the ability to have um, less regulation, the ability to bring in other talent from other areas. A lot of it has to do with rent, asset subsidies, things like that. To me, that's really about engineering the bowl. But the fish, the core thing that comes to create an economic cluster is not the bowl, it's not the water, it's the fish. And so the critical thing is, how do you get the fish, and what kind of fish do you want first to start an economic cluster? And I love the work of Mike Porter. Mike's one of the things I think, and I took a course from Mike. I read a lot of his work, got to know him some. One of the things that Mike doesn't really talk about is the individuals and their motivation, the great geniuses who actually start things. He will mention them, but he quickly goes to the structural issues. And I would say, in the balance, and the history, I think, is a balance between great people doing great things and structures and situations. For me, Mike's meter is set too far toward the structures and situations. And so the remainder of this conversation will be about, let's get some of the individuals and their motivations back in the core of where economic development comes from. Okay, so here's an example of somebody trying to engineer a bowl. Anybody here, seen this thing that Saudi Arabia was trying to do actually before MBS, and it's called NEOM. It actually stands for the first three letters of the Greek word for new, neo, and then Mostakabal, which is Arabic, and probably mispronouncing that, Arabic for the future. So it's a new future. And it's in the incredibly unpopulated area of the northwest of Saudi Arabia. And in here, they are literally going to spend $1.5 trillion to build the bowl. But I would say they're not going to get any fish. They might get some water, maybe desalinated, but they're not going to get anything that's actually going to spark this into be the innovation city that I hope it will be. And I'll explain why I think that's the case. Any questions or thoughts so far? All right. At the core, I believe, is the notion of two cultures. It's a gift culture and a paid culture. And what I mean by this is that this is one of the things that a lot of people think that you can have things like philanthrocapitalism. I think philanthrocapitalism is a dumb idea. And the reason is it mixes two motives that I believe live in separate realms. The gift culture is motivated by an incredible question, a common good, mankind, fame in there to be the most, the most brilliant person in their field. Paid culture is about economic return. There's great evidence of this on an individual basis from common sense and also from behavioral economics. People have done studies where if you're unpacking, or sorry, you're moving into a new apartment and you want to get your couch up to the third floor, and you ask people, will you give me a hand? You're likely to get volunteers to help give you a hand. If you say, I'll give you $1 or $5 to help me bring this up, you're much less likely to get a person to help you until you get up into a lot of money, 50 bucks, $100. Why is that? Because in the gift culture, yeah, I'll give you a hand. Once you offer me $5, you've brought me into the paid culture. So now I'm saying, hey, is it worth it to me for $5 to take this thing up 3 flights of stairs? Who do you think I am? So the problem is that the gift culture is actually motivated by very different things, and putting the two of them together, I think, causes a huge problem. So gift culture folks are motivated like this. What are the key resources they want? Freedom, talent, equipment, Slack resources. Paul's uncle was a Nobel Prize winning biologist. And if Paul's willing, we have time, he'll tell about this issue about having the ability for him and his wife to do what they wanted to do academically. This man could have made millions, tens of millions, maybe billions of dollars. He didn't care. He just wanted to have the best talent, his lab, and the freedom to do his research. Whereas, paid culture, of course, cheap capital, great talent, favorable regulation. Career management, very interesting. Strangely, a lot of gift culture people, especially in the academic realm and in the civil service realm, and remember in the gift culture, you also have people in the military, you have people in bureaucracies that build science, that do governmental work. They're really interested in more of a clear path and freedom and influence, and they don't want to give up their tenure track at Stanford or MIT or at a high class institution. That's what they don't want to give up, but they really aren't about getting more and more money and more power. Time frame is longer, usually years and decades, and they're more patient in the discovery process. And of course, capital, any form of capital, um, venture capital at the most is 7 years. It's usually less. Private equity is 3 to 5 at best. Even these evergreen funds, once you put a time frame on something, you have to get an economic return, right? And then the community is very different. It's not competitive; it's cooperative. And I'm not so naive as to think there are certainly competitive forces and also scoundrels in the gift culture who try to grab credit for things and so forth. But in the main, it's a process of building on others and sharing. Okay. So, what are industries that have benefited from gift culture discoveries early on? Well, let's go down the list. Computing, telecommunications, space, transportation, food, entertainment, healthcare, defense, energy, and education. Other than that, ladies and gentlemen, right? So this always annoys me about the libertarians. They're so ahistoric. I mean, you got to love somebody who makes their money on PayPal, which was built on the internet, and the banking system, both big recipients of gift culture, and then space, which is completely built by the gift culture, to then go and rip down the common good. Anyway, we'll leave that alone. But pretty much everything that the United States is globally competitive in began with either military, a philanthropic, or scientific push. Okay, let's talk about Silicon Valley for a minute. Fred Terman. So Fred um, was he worked with Vannevar Bush right after World War II, and he became the head of engineering at Stanford. And he created the Stanford Research Park, and he started to encourage the folks at Stanford when they're doing their scientific research to go start to build companies and to place them over over at the Stanford Research Park. So Hewlett and Packard were there, Varian Associates moved in there, and those early contracts were all with the government, almost all with the government. So Fred, coming from the gift culture, creates the environment, encourages the scientists to go and create new companies funded by governmental activity. On the right hand side, we have William Shockley. Shockley was the one who got the Nobel Prize for the invention of the transistor. He was the one who created Shockley Semiconductor. Shockley Semiconductor, there was the traitorous eight who went to work with him. He was apparently an incredibly bad boss, not commercially successful, but he had moved out to Silicon Valley to be near his mother, who was convalescing in Silicon Valley. And Bob Noyce and Gordon Moore both worked for him, and they went off to start Intel and Fairchild Semiconductor and other things. So again, Silicon Valley started from the gift culture, was literally housed next to Stanford, and then began the commercialization as we know it today. Let's take a look at the internet. Mark Anderson over on the right-hand side here. Where did he get his start? Well, the guy over on the left is a guy by the name of Larry Smart, good friend of mine. Larry is one of God's great creatures. He won the Golden Goose Award from Congress for creating more wealth from the grants that they had given him than anyone else in his class, right? What Larry did, he was at one of the supercomputing centers. He worked with Al Gore to create the 5 supercomputing centers in the United States back when they commercialized the internet. I know Al Gore gets beat up a lot. He didn't actually say he invented the internet. What happened was he was part of the group that put together the supercomputing centers, and then with the assistance of Gordon Bell and others, were the ones who brought together ARPANET, BitNet, and so forth, and created the .com. And so they actually did do the internetworking and created the nodes to manage the addressing structures and so forth. And Al Gore was in the middle of that. Anyway, Larry at the time was running the supercomputing center at Champaign-Urbana in Illinois, which is the 5th most prestigious computing school in the world. So anyway, Larry's there, and Larry's got a problem. His problem is he's a polymath, but one of his interests is simulating how he's a computational astrophysicist, and he wants to simulate how galaxies collide. And he actually predicted gravity waves, which they discovered later. Anyway, so where's he going to get the compute power? Because, you can imagine these are pretty big models. So what he does is he puts a grant request into the National Science Foundation, and for $5 million, he builds the first 1 gigabit backbone to the internet, okay? So that he can actually simulate galaxies colliding, because when you have a 1 gig backbone at the time, the latency among the clusters was actually less than from the different processing subnodes to the backplane. I mean, that's how fast, that's how the timing differential worked at the time. So, it's like one giant computer, right? Anyway, so Larry does that, successfully publishes this stuff. Who's hanging around? A young man who had a lot of hair at the time, by the name of Mark Anderson. And he builds a thing called Mosaic at that supercomputing lab. And then he goes on to found Netscape, and the rest, as they say, is history. But again, Anderson is there, seeing all this stuff, being in the middle of it, because Larry, gift culture, and by the way, Larry's done okay, but he's not a wealthy guy. He doesn't care about the money. His philosophy is that he wants to build the thing that's 10 years out so we can discover what is possible. Okay. And by the way, a lot of the advanced neural chips and so forth, some of the ARM processors and so forth, were built by folks that Larry taught. He's at UC San Diego. He's actually, well, he's retired now, but he created this thing called Cal IT2, which was between UCSD and UC Irvine, and some of the world's great computer architects were trained there. Anyway, Kendall Square, Eric Lander. Okay, I don't know if you know Eric. He is a genius. Okay, I had the very great misfortune of being my very first class I ever taught at Harvard Business School. I followed Eric Lander into the classroom. Okay, and I'm there, and I barely know. I'm holding on by my fingernails. Eric is not only a mathematical genius. He was teaching decision science, and he taught like decision. He taught decision trees. And when he laid out decision, for those of you who know decision trees, you break a problem into possible alternatives, you put probabilities on it, you fold it all back into an expected value. Okay. So he first day he teaches that stuff. He lays it out, makes it super clear to the students, and then as he's summing up the class, he quotes Robert Frost's poem to I came to two roads in a yellow wood from front to back. He quotes the whole poem and ends the class. Okay. And I go in there. I barely know what I'm doing. Anyway, that's Eric Lander. In addition, that's my personal relationship with him. Eric was one of the mathematicians that helped decode the human genome. Not so bad. And over on the right hand side, we have this lovely picture of Edith and Eli Broad. Now, Eli Broad was the only guy that ever built two Fortune 500 companies during his lifetime. It was American Securities and KB Homes. Two Fortune 500 companies, both publicly traded in one lifetime. Not so bad. Anyway, Eli looks at Eric and he wants to create better genetic science for society. He's a great philanthropist. He gave a ton of stuff in LA and so forth. But he backs Eric first with 50 million bucks, then 150 million, then 400, then 200 million more to capitalize the thing, creates the Broad Institute. The Broad Institute is in Kendall Square. The Broad Institute builds on the work of the Whitehead Institute. John Whitehead gave a huge donation, and his desire was to decrease the time between science in the lab and human use for human health, to decrease that. So again, two massive gift culture things. And Eric, and if you look at Kendall Square now, right? Genetown, it is literally the most productive from an economic and scientific standpoint square mile on the planet. Think about that for a minute. The most productive square mile on the planet. There's a lot of square miles on the planet. Okay. And this is all, it wouldn't be there if Eric at the Broad Institute couldn't do things that are relevant to the gift culture. You can be a Broad Fellow. You're at Harvard, MIT, Stanford, wherever you are. You don't have to give up your position. Remember I said they want security in what they're doing? What does he give them? He gives them Slack resources. Oh, you want to do some computational translational genetics that the NSF won't fund or will take you 2 years to go get the money? I'll give you the money. You want to bring in some young talent because you know the way that doctoral student, the smart faculty know all the great doctoral students that are coming up. And most hard scientists have a performance curve that looks just like pro football, 18 to 28. Okay. Einstein never came up with anything genius after he was 21. Now, it took him 40 years to figure it, what he thought of out, right? You take a look at Darwin. Darwin died sad. He didn't have another origin of the species in him, right? He died completely depressed. So how do you get at those students? You give up and coming faculty Slack resources. They reach down and they get the great intellectual athletes to come and work with them.
Hey, John, Sviokla, John Warner's online. He has an interesting fact from the Whitehead family.
Oh,
John, you want to share that?
Yeah,
yes,
yeah. I mean, some of you may know this. I guess Whitehead was like the Bill Gates of his time, had a lot of resources, and originally he approached Duke to take that gift and to build the Whitehead Institute, and it was basically giving tenure for life to a bunch of biology professors to be innovative, and Duke passed on it, and MIT was the second choice, and a guy named Phil Sharp was pretty instrumental those early days. And one of the 18 faculty that did have tenure was Eric Lander, and he did spin out and took Eli Broad's money. I met Eli Broad a few times, and my wife was a Broad fellow. Wonderful man. And I think he do TV Guide too. Was that part of one of those?
No. That was the Annenberg family. I don't know if Eli had a relationship.
Yeah, I may be confusing those two families, but I do think it's interesting that Kendall Square reinvented itself, and now it's the Silicon Valley of biotech. But if the Whitehead hadn't happened and had ended up at Duke, I don't think we'd be sitting here talking about it. And I know Phil Sharp was actually offered the presidency of MIT, and he accepted it. And 24 hours later, he declined because he said, well, you know what, I actually want to get a Nobel Prize in biology. I think being an administrator, like being president of MIT, will get in the way. And hence Chuck Vest came and was the next president. So if you know your MIT history, there was one guy who was a life science guy that was president for a day, and then he came to his senses. But he totally benefited from the Whitehead. And I know Susan Whitehead, the daughter, and she's very involved in that. And there's a lot of great stories there.
That's wonderful, John. And John, feel free to, if you think I'm getting any of this like wrong, either in detail or in major things, please feel free to jump in. But this notion of getting going with the gift.
Eric went on to be the Biden scientific advisor, and in this I was asked to step down. So that's a whole nother dynamic of our stuff to be aware. I don't know if you've touched on that much.
Yes, I don't know the backstory on that. I do know that Eric did not suffer fools well. I don't know if that had anything to do with it, but yes, there are as with Shockley, sometimes genius brings its own special challenges, right? To deal with. So I don't know the backstory on Eric, but my interactions with him he was quite generous and quite wonderful. So this notion of gift culture being at the core of what is going on, and if you're a policymaker or a politician or whatever, and you're trying to say, okay, I want to have an economic cluster, a lot of them try to get companies to come. Companies don't invent industries. They don't. The few companies that invented whole new industries, like remember back to Shockley and AT&T, remember it was a monopoly, right? It was a monopoly, and they had enough money so that they would make massive investments in R&D. You have some companies that stand out in quantum computing right now, folks like, Microsoft and Google and so forth. But again, a lot of that is funded by the federal government or by state governments, but usually the federal government in terms of driving that forward. Microsoft's been investing in quantum for 17 years. Okay. I think if they didn't have the government backing in that, they wouldn't have been in that for that long. Okay. So this notion of the gift culture driving a lot of it. Another thing you can do is you can hope that a genius comes and lands in your area, and you wait 20 years for the cluster to develop. So when Henry Ford went to Detroit, but even Henry Ford was building on the science that the Germans had created in KIT, which was the Kolsberg Institute of Technology. John, you'll know this. It was the model that Barton, who started MIT, used, because it was where Carl Benz created the carburetor, the spark plug, and invented the first internal combustion engine. So in a certain sense, Ford, like Musk, optimized stuff that was already done, right? It actually was invented.
Well, here, I can add to this. So there's a guy named Charles Eliot who was a student at Harvard, and he applied to teach at the Lawrence School of Sciences. That was where science and engineering was done early days. And he was passed over for a job. So he became a founding chemistry professor at MIT when MIT was founded in 1861. But he took 2 years off, and he traveled to Europe, and he saw the gymnasium in Germany. He saw the French apprentice schools and the PhD programs there. And he came back, and for 2 years, he was a chemistry professor at MIT. And he wrote a book about working with industry, hands-on learning. It was very revolutionary. And he put it in a magazine, Atlantic Monthly, and that was popular media back then. And Harvard loved it so much that they hired him to be their president, even though they had passed over him 2 years earlier to be a science professor. And for 44 years, he was president of Harvard and really brought Harvard into the modern era. So the Charles Eliot Bridge is named after him. But he got his inspiration from what you're just talking about, all the German model of learning.
Yes. Yeah, and moving Harvard into the 19th century was not that easy back then, for sure. So yeah, so this interplay, this beautiful dynamic dance between the gift culture and the paid culture, we really need to understand that. And why is that the case? Well, first down the bottom here, what a lot of people, and this is where I would extend Mike Porter's work. Um, I don't think he gives enough attention to the fact that at the core of economic development, especially these economic clusters, is a very small number of very talented people that create that economic cluster. They in time, you start with the gift culture people and the paid culture people come, right? And I believe that will be true going forward. That's why Neom is never going to go anywhere unless they figure out how to get gift culture people to spend time there and to work there, which is a high bar given their approach. Why is it? Discovery's patient. Discovery is tolerant of time uncertainty as long as progress is being made. Discovery attracts talent. Nobody ever sits back and says, why is it that people are willing to live in Northern California? Let's talk about Northern California. Weather's great. That's good. Okay. But it's expensive. The traffic is terrible. The taxes are awful. You literally can't buy a garage in Palo Alto for less than $1 million. Why is that? Because great talent, when they're pursuing a great question with a great colleague, will swim through lava to do that work. That's why it attracts talent. The other thing is discovery is generous. Again, I'm not saying, look, there's work now that says Watson and Crick actually stole some of the thinking, or at least didn't give enough credit to people in the discovery DNA. I'm not saying that gift culture people are somehow morally better, but the enterprise as a whole is about sharing information and standing on the shoulders of giants, right? That's not true in commercial. And I think that this notion of early access to new innovations to broaden the application. A lot of people don't realize that Sperry Univac tried to patent the computer, but because they had seen John Atanasoff's stored program computer at the University of Iowa, the ABC, the Atanasoff Berry computer, the ABC computer that the Eckert and Mulkey started Univac, they had gone and visited at Nassau. And at Nassau, because he was at the University of Iowa, it was open, right? Open access to the IP. When Sperry Univac tried to patent the computer, that was the reason, because of at Nassau, they were not able to patent the computer, and we had a vibrant computer industry in the United States. If at Nassau had been working at Bell Labs or someplace like that, that wouldn't have happened. So the gift culture discovery is a generous process. It creates a common good that we all participate in. Okay. So before I get to the last three questions here, so these I think are the questions that if you want to have a vibrant city, and these are the questions we have to answer for Boston. How do we attract the very best gift culture talent on the AI topic? How do we do that? How do we create an institution the way Eli Broad purposely made the Broad Institute interinstitutional because, well, first of all, there's a lot of politics going on. That wasn't really true when Eli gave the money. Universities are dealing with a lot of craziness right now, I think. But if you give the money, like I think John Doerr, when he gave $1.5 billion to Stanford, by the way, I'm pretty arrogant to say anybody who's got $1.5 billion to give away is making a mistake. So I understand that part. But anyway, I think he made a big mistake that when he gave it to Stanford, because when you give it to Stanford, first thing that happens is Stanford takes their cut off the top. Universities are like the mafia. What's our slice, right? What's our taste? You got to take it off the top. Then they're likely to use Stanford talent. The problem is, hey, Stanford, I'm sure, has great talent. 98th, 99th percentile, 95th percentile in the world. But great talent, the difference between the 98th best percentile and the 99.9 percentile, it's probably a full standard deviation, if not two, when you get up that high. So it's a massive difference when you can pick the best talent in the world and bring it together, not have to go through your talent supply chain, right? And the other thing is that having been an academic, there's an old joke in academia that a faculty member gets so frustrated with the decision-making process and how slow it was that he decided to commit suicide. So he went out and he stood in front of a glacier. That is academia, okay? So what you want is you want a small cadre of very talented people, geniuses, judging other geniuses as to who should get the money. You can't do that if you give $1.5 billion to Stanford. You can do that if you set up the Broad Institute and you put Eric in charge. So,
I might challenge you a little bit on that, John. This is Tim.
Okay.
I think a lot more. I'm an Alan Kay groupie, as you know, and I met many others who were part of the original ARPA community through the years, and I think more people should study ARPA because ARPA has some of the characteristics you were talking about.
Absolutely.
They funded a lot of institutions, not just any single one. But their philosophy was, we're going to fund them all to do what they want, but we're going to give them enough money to cooperate when they feel like it. So it sort of got some of the characteristics you were talking about, which is a broad set of the best people. And they really, I think, did have the best people. And they sort of judged each other to a certain extent. But the central office didn't spend much money. They gave people some rope. And then if they didn't get very far very quickly, they kicked them out, basically.
Yeah, I'm not saying that. My impression of what's happening when you look at ARPA, the Office of Naval Research, National Science Foundation, some time ago, National Institute, right before it seemed to change under Reagan, right? That things got into big science and that kind of stuff, and now it's getting hugely politicized. But if I could go back to a bunch of smart bureaucrats giving out small money to geniuses, I'm totally there for that.
Well, I think the really, I would say it goes back to Nixon and even almost a little bit before, because the key thing, as you said, is what these people valued was freedom, intellectual freedom in particular. And so the mantra in the early days was short proposals, long reports. So they didn't put a lot of strings on the entry, but they put a lot of emphasis on the results. And we sort of have inverted that, I think, now that the government mostly wants the proposal to declare victory, and then you write the report to match the proposal.
Right, which is why people now they actually are submitting what they're finding from their previous grant as their next grant so that they can actually get enough certainty to get the money. Yes, I mean, guys like Licklider
Licklider in particular.
I remember reading
papers.
Well,
and again, see, the thing with Xerox PARC, to me, that was a big transition because Xerox PARC was commercial. I don't think it would have been successful, but that it was basically created by ARPA. So they were really all ARPA people, and then they were refugees from ARPA. And then a lot of the Xerox PARC people ended up being refugees at Apple. So you get these little clusters of movement like that. And I think we're in a difficult place because commercial controls all the research now. I don't know how to answer. I think the best way to attract the gift culture is to go back to more of an ARPA model. Keep these people in the academic institutions and fund them generously, which doesn't take a lot of money because, as you said, they don't want a lot of money.
Right.
Keep them out of commercial because commercial people don't do research. They really don't. I mean, they will do it occasionally because they have so much money, but as soon as they find anything that works, they stop the research and start the selling.
Yeah, please do not read this as saying that I don't think that government and bureaucrats can do great stuff, and I'm optimistic that I bet there's people who are doing stuff in cybersecurity right now and robotics and so forth that have that spirit of the old ARPA, right? And giving small amounts of money to geniuses. An alternative way is like the Broad Institute, right? You let the those folks start to divvy
Yeah,
out.
Bird worked pretty well. Yeah.
John,
And
we
again,
have
I also agree completely that it's the force of nature kind of personalities like Eric Lander and Landers. He's whatever his difficulties in working with, he is a force of nature. And Phil Sharp, by the way, was another one.
Yeah.
And you know, Bob Taylor, who founded Park, these people were incredible.
Right.
And has a lot to do with it. Isn't there also some random stuff like uh, you know, Xerox PARC ended up in Silicon Valley, not because of Silicon Valley, which was still pretty small at the time, but because they wanted to be far away from Xerox, which happened to be in New York. And so they sort of, you know, kind of these random things, and then you get the clustering around that once you get these little bits of start.
Yeah.
Sorry, John, I want to just interrupt that. Kelly's raised her hand. She's got
Kelly.
a question.
Yeah.
Hi, thanks. Can you guys hear me
Kelly,
okay?
how are you?
Yeah.
We can, Kelly. Go ahead.
Okay, great. So, I guess I'm approaching this a little less from a scientific level and more from a strategy level. My history is in R&D for corporate food. And I've leaned in really hard to the whole AI saving the planet thing. But it is true that with data science and AI, there's a lot that can be done for agriculture and just the food industry in general. So I consider that somewhat philanthropic because at its core, sustainability is faceless, classless, and raceless. Unfortunately, it is mired by a lot of political influence, which is not. So and let's just, for the sake of discussion, what kind of strategy could sustainability implement as far as the gifting meets the capitalism intersection?
Yeah. Well, let me opine on something I know very little about, but have lots of opinions on, which is which is the John Doerr $1.5 billion. Okay. Let's say something like that. Obviously, food is central to sustainability, every aspect of it, right? Um, and imagine that Doerr had done something like set up, the Hoover Institute of sustainability, and had a big track. And Kelly, you probably know these people. Who are the 2 or 3 geniuses that when you have dinner with them and you say, "Look, uh, Paul, if I gave you 10 million bucks, what would you do with it?" And the people you want doing this are people they can name for you. Well, I would get, this person from Australia. I would get this person from Iowa. I would get this person from Tasmania, and they would be working on, this new, genetically
Your
transmuted.
dream team, right? Yeah.
What's that? And
Your
they
dream
would
team.
the dream team, but the fact that they would know what they should work on and who they are, and one of them would be a doctoral student, and one would be like that. You give that person slack resources, and it goes back to what Tim was saying. That's what ARPA used to do. That's what Xerox PARC under Taylor did, right? And that's the difference as opposed to having a committee meeting at Stanford about this initiative and blah blah
Yeah.
blah and all that other stuff, right? So absolutely. I mean, I think that's the juice of this. And like for example, when I was a lot younger, I get into permaculture a little bit, right? And Bill Mollison and his work out of Tasmania, right?
Yeah.
There's phenomenal whole system ways of thinking about that. I mean, he had designs where if you lived in Melbourne in an apartment with a 5 by 3 meter porch, you could grow half your food on that porch. I mean, now you got to be ready to eat weird shit at different times of the year to make that work, but
Right.
that's an amazing breakthrough, you know?
Yeah.
So somebody who's the Bill Mollison today? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so I think
Kelly,
that's
did I answer your question?
Well, it did in the sort of who do we cultivate from the science perspective in that philanthropic way. But for me, I think the challenge is, for instance, people like Nestle. Nestle is the world's largest manufacturer in the world for food, consumer packaged goods. They are pouring billions of dollars into their sustainability packages, not only because they have a huge carbon footprint, but because they see the profitability in it. They're not doing it out of the kindness of their heart. So it's for me, I want to approach this as, listen, it's great for our planet. It's great for our bodies. It's great for our food system and for food deserts and food insecurity, all those things. But look, you can make a ton of money while you're doing it too. And those are two very hard classes to marry together, you know?
Yeah, I guess I don't believe that. Okay.
That's hard to get those people together, that you can make a lot of money in sustainability.
That you can make a lot of money in sustainability. I think the only way you can make a lot of money in sustainability is if governments properly price externalities and there's no political will to do that.
But that's where, yeah, that's the biggest hurdle, is the political involvement in it. Yeah.
Yeah,
We've
but
got
I mean,
just 2 minutes, John. I just want
Sorry.
to be sensitive time.
sorry.
Is there
Anyway,
any other
so
questions?
Thank you,
that's
thank
what
you.
And the other thing, Kelly, the problem is that when I'm working for Nestle, I'm not going to get the geniuses who are motivated by public good.
Nope.
I'm just not.
True. Well said. Thank you.
Big topic. Let's get 1 or 2 more questions. Go ahead, Douglas, before we wrap
Just
up.
real quickly, I'm curious, where do we go from here with this? I feel like you set us up for this journey of how do we turn Boston into this, new economic enclave. Do you have a strategy around this? Do you want to crowdsource this? What are you thinking?
Well, I would love to have a conversation. I don't believe at the design phase crowdsourcing is good because you have fragmented design. Okay, and I think you have to. And so I would love to have a conversation with the interested about these 3 questions. How can we create a permissive intellectual property approach that encourages wide use? How do we create the kind of institutions? Tim and I went back and forth a little bit about that. And then how do we create the very best gift culture talent? I'll give you two examples in AI. How do we really think about open source on algorithms and data and so forth? And then what I think, Harvard did a little bit with its, massive data set, but I think there's all kinds of data sets and training and capability that should be there. And then the second thing is, what's the public library of AI? Ben Franklin created the public library in the United States. What's the public library of AI? Those are just 2 things that if we start to ask, in terms of how we would make that common good happen, I think it would be fantastic.